Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the John H. Ames reading series. As you know, this reading series features works of Nebraska authors. This evening's reader is Georgia Robertson. Ms. Robertson is working towards a PhD at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. While at the University of Nebraska, she's won the Reland's Award for Creative Writing in 1985, and she also won the American Academy of Poets University Award in 1987. Her writing has appeared in Plain Songs for the past 7 years, and last fall she gave a reading at the Western Literature Association Conference. Ms. Robertson is also the administrator of the Southeast Library System.
Thank you for coming tonight. Thanks to my friends who out of friendship come, and to see if I can get through this, on the guarantee that we get out before Knots Landing, of course, which we will try and do. And also to the people that work with me in the library world. A lot of them are coming, I think, to see what I've been doing in the closet all these years instead of being just an administrator for the library system. I was real delighted to see Margaret Atwood reviewed in the Daily Nebraskan today, because my opening quote to my collection, which is called Escaping Guest, is an Atwood quote, and I want to share it with you because it kind of talks about why I write, and I think why a lot of us put words to page. Writing, no matter what its subject, is an act of faith, the primary faith being that someone out there will read the results or hear the results. I believe it's also an act of hope, the hope things can be better than they are. If the writer is very lucky and manages to live long enough, I think it's also an act of charity. It takes a lot to see what is there, both without flinching or turning away, and without bitterness. The world exists, the writer testifies. And I like that quote because it talks a little bit about why I write. I'm going to start out with some kind of simple poems. The first one is called Naming. I come from a large family, and my father hasn't gotten my name right, I think, for 7 years or so. He calls me occasionally by one sister's name or the other, and it's gotten to be a family joke. And it dawned on me one day that just that simple truth of living in families means a little bit more than what we might think it does. And this is called Naming. If I go too fast, wave at me, I mean in a violent way, because otherwise I will not see you, and I'll continue reading too quickly. In a family like ours, it's hard to get names straight. You know how it is. Years of calling, yelling, pleading with one another, until slowly, with family time, everyone merges into everyone else. Father can't be blamed when one child's name slips out to christen someone else over the rush at dinner. And what sister can be expected to recognize one brother's voice from another over the phone when age and distance brings tenor down to bass? If mom is sometimes dad or dad is mom, there is no confusion to it, just the habit of giving title where title is due, recognition in its proper place. Who remembers exactly why one was named this, another that? Whether for some relative or not, it hardly seems to matter. All we know is what we see before us, years of learning to claim this one as our own, belonging to no one else, no other family tree or Bible or current census. When it comes down to it, the names have run themselves into one long litany, said over and over, a prayer without amen, running in chorus through our heads for at least as long as the lot of us shall live. We know who sits with us at table, even with our eyes closed, our heads bowed in silence. That's for my family. I was the firstborn, and you'd think he could get my name right, even if he can't get the other 5 children right. Along this same line, these are family poems. They're in the first section of my manuscript. One thing as you get a little older is you learn you kind of have to parent yourself eventually. It's real hard at 36 to call mom and dad and ask for money any longer. This came from a habit, this poem generated from a habit I had as a real young girl. You're going to learn all these deep secrets about me during this 45 minutes. I would sleep, and I had to have one foot out of the bed, out of the covers, whenever I slept. Do any of you do this kind of thing? And, no, thanks. And my folks would come in every night to check on me, and they'd always see this one foot thrown out of the cover. And so that's the habit that I'm talking about in this poem. It's called Say Goodnight. Half asleep, I'd hear my parents look in towards my cave of sleeping, with the candle of their life streaming in from behind, and they'd remark only on the unconscious habit, the movement of my one leg, its calf a gleam thrown out of the folds of my bed, the sole of my foot turned up, open to the black ceiling, a tiny curving magnet that pulled at them night after night. They'd watch for it, the slip of moon flesh rising. Now, before sleep, sinking down after closing all the lights one after another, I watch myself step to my door, peer through the night to find my leg, ankle, foot pushed out of the blankets for the open air, a cave-blind fish rising to the surface seeking a darkness less heavy. Like my parents before me, I turn in my covers, say good night to myself, to them no longer with me, and give myself to sleep. I still do that, I have to admit. Habit that's carried on. What I'm exploring in this first section about families is how families are not just necessarily your brothers and sisters and parents and relatives that are bound to love you by blood ties, but also people like those here, friends and extended family. And there are no limits to who your family might be. And this next poem is about that kind of a feeling. It's called Family Grave, and it's about how a young boy at the age of 10 learns that the man he's seen every day in the hardware store for all the Saturdays of his young life is a member of his family, too, in an interesting way. Family Grave. When it's time to think of graves, he tells me he'll think of graves. For now, there is enough just in raising these boys now their mother is gone. When he was young, his father took him Saturdays to the hardware store up to town where the door gleamed as it opened, and the bell sent out ripples of greeting over the rows of shelves inside, shining like a string of silver fish hanging on a silver wire. When the old man walked down the aisle, smiling and holding out his arms, welcome shone from him like sun. The next he knew, he was only 10 years old, trying to hold up a dying old man and falling to his knees with the weight of it. He said it bothered him some, whether to go to the funeral and sit in the first pew with the widow, the children older than he and silent, or not to go at all but stay out of sight, being responsible for the last breath of this man he could hardly say he had ever known. In the end, he didn't even go, not to apologize, not to see the casket or the man inside cold, but stayed at home. With time, he left off worrying there being other things to do in the equal press of year after year. Why stop now to think or plan ahead where he'd be buried when it was time, or who'd come to lie next to him in what empty plot on what hill? Hi, come in. One last family poem. I'm trying not to be too morbid, and excuse me if these all sound like grave poems. Bob McEwen, what are you doing in town? Nice to see you. Well, thank you. I'm delighted. You came for the basketball tournament, didn't you? Oh, okay. All right. My grandmother died this summer, and all of my relatives are from Georgia, which is where I got my name. And I went down to attend her funeral. She was in her late 90s. She had a good long life. And we went to a small country cemetery in rural Georgia and stood there in the beating hot sun. And I felt really quite happy to be there, and I realized it was rather unseemly to have this feeling of joy welling up in me at this funeral when everyone had fairly long faces. And that's where this poem came from. It's called Behind Us All, Davis Cemetery, Rutledge, Georgia. Remember standing in sunshine and the yellow butterfly tossing in the air above her grave like the echo of laughter from a child left to herself? How the yellow roses wilted across her coffin, melting in color, green Georgia hill swelling in the wind, warm life of your skin beating beneath cotton? Every sound came to you as if released from prison. Joy was unseemly, slipping out of you to float above the fine lines of the iron fence, the boundaries of stone marked by names of so many lives. Above the mowed fields, the smell of new-cut hay, it lifted like song. Colors burned like fire from a burning glass, and life was so good, its end was your plenty. A family of faces circled for one life spent among them. Behind us all was the light. Okay, change tempo a little bit here. We've been talking about how families don't have limits and there aren't any boundaries in those relationships, really. This is a poem about how there aren't any boundaries for individuals either, and at some point, hopefully in your life, you realize you can go anywhere and do anything that you want to. And some of you have heard this before, but I've always liked it, so I thought I'd read it again. It's called Summer License. Summer License. It's been like this before. The air a hint of butterscotch, so quietly thick you turn your head slowly from side to side, moving pockets of color, flavor, smell, those parcels sent out from your flesh out of the mixture of you and all you touch and see. That summer I learned to drive a stick shift from a young man. Hot afternoons when melting seemed to drown us, we'd displace air in that truck. My hands burned to touch the steering wheel. The tops of his knees went shiny, glowing brown with heat. The smell of spilled gasoline loosened my insides into colors, into something burnished, soft, a glowing that traced its wet course down my back to circle my ankles and hold me as I sought for clutch, then brake. I learned I could move in any direction, run into myself without accident, without pain, no longer only aware, here is where I begin, or here where I end. All the while, that same warm golden attention that stops me now, to movement inside and out, the color of his nameless skin, and the shape of his nameless hands. When I smell gasoline, I still think of learning to drive a pickup truck. That was a major event in my life, to drive a stick shift. I don't suppose people get that excited about something like that. It was an accomplishment for me. This one is one I wrote this fall. We've been talking about no limits and boundaries that aren't there. So I was driving down to Kansas. I do a lot of traveling with the job I'm in now, and some of these poems will relate to that traveling. And watching the geese overhead, and you're in a car, and you can see them, but you can't hear them, just that faint call that you hear. And they just seem to move on their own up there. And it reminded me of the whole idea of limits, and that sometimes when you reach to see there are no limits, it's kind of a little eerie to know that you can just keep going, reaching, and it'll never get to something at the other side. And the Geese brought this poem. It's called Geese Held in a Kansas Sky. Lines of birds above me stir as if I had taken fingers to barely touch them, folded feathers held close to their separate bodies until they are one form, moving so slightly it seems none move. They gather and breathe away in a ripple, in a touch of air that shifts the sky, faint now with color in the tenderest of lines. Here the air wakes and turns to its side, lifts from sleep in a moment without witness, then drifts off, turns to close its eyes. This moving is a wistfulness of sound, calls of birds across a clear, empty place, hard to put words to, but heard like a sigh coming from inside a person, one lying next to you in another country. A small and hidden sound that suddenly is close at hand at your elbow. You hear an echo, lost before it finishes. Down here with me, there is nothing solid to stand on, but the thought of watching and the hope of seeing the sky turn over in this time, catching a glimpse as the geese rise and lift off air to vanish, falling back behind the slight curve of world. Okay. Am I going too fast? Critics in the front row. The next set of poems come from a section that is kind of focused on what it means to live in the West. Although my father came from Georgia, my mother came from North Dakota, and we never went anywhere except Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, that area. This first one is about a woman who came to Nebraska, then went on to Colorado, and a lot of you know her. Her name was Molly Sanford. You might have read her journal, The Journal of Molly Sanford. Got real inspired when I read this journal about this remarkable woman who moved family and children and did all these kind of things. And at the very end, the editor makes a few comments about what happened to her after the period of this journal. Irritated the heck out of me. He says what her husband did the rest of his life, and what a remarkable fellow he was, and that she was remembered as a tower of strength by her family and friends. And I thought, you've given me a whole journal about this woman, and you dismiss her like that. And so this poem comes as a result of that, and it's for Molly and others like her. It ends with a quote in the beginning of her journal. She writes because she says she does not want to be forgotten. And it seemed to me that was really ironic that, in a sense, even after her book was published, she was forgotten in a way. She is remembered as a tower of strength for Molly and the others. Years later, most people remember what her husband did. Write of his life, the monument of his labor in wood, steel, plowed land, the carpenter, the builder, the owner of acres. Her memory will come by second chance to all her children's children, some accidental gathering of family where they recall her recipes, the fruit she put by, good and sweet, butter melting on hot bread. In the midst of remembering will come the aroma and taste and color she brought, floating faint ripples of light over their heads. Herself poured out, making solid the strength in lives they live, picking countless apples till her face blushed to color, the trail of plum juice down her mother arms, her arteries of blood, effort, voice, hot paraffin blistering her broad hand, notes of song she might have sung had she the time, the audience, an ache of needing for mouths she tried to fill, the smear of flour across her tired face, the end of one long day after another, children that grew to man and daughter. Secretly, they remember even more, like opening clouds over their heads for a sight of prairie sky and sun. Frozen in their minds now, the silent moments, her words that built a fortress against their dark, her gifts of routine that made the village of their days with such cement, such nails that now it is her gifts define, her strength of body left them, that their forms and skin can balance all against the demolition. Her last cry, a whisper in their bones, because I do not want to be forgotten. There are other women in Nebraska who we don't tend to know a lot about. In my traveling, I do go to a lot of small towns and meet village and small town librarians, and there's one woman that I met during my travels in Alexandria when I was having coffee in a cafe down there, and just a very elderly lady whose main thing that she does every day is she goes on walks down the highway north in Alexandria with her cat, and I would see them occasionally when I would go down there walking along the highway. So here's another woman that we don't want to forget, and she has something to teach us too. This is called Hour in Alexandria. Alexandria is a real small village, not village, it's a town, I guess, township, south Nebraska. Hour in Alexandria. What business is it of yours that her life is something slightly more than the taking of her single meal, the quiet touch of spoon to plate, silver to white, her movement, her sound, just as the sun comes to the window at morning? Or that evening she walks down the highway, walks against cars coming from the north, still flinging up drops of rain from the road to splash at her feet, send the tall weeds shivering back to the edges of green and summer. The shawl around her shoulders is worn, bare of color or design, but she pulls it around her, pale wings from the quiet dusk. Her smile says, everything is as good as it can be. And you don't know, haven't a clue to tell her whether what you think is right or wrong, if the clouds will lift by morning or still be hanging there, low, fading slowly into whiteness, holding the world in water and silence. We don't want to leave the men out in the audience, so I have a poem for men, about men. In Morrill, Nebraska, which I drive through often on my way home to Casper, I go that direction too, is an old house, great big old house with a veranda in the front, lots of windows, several stories, the old Nebraska kind of home that you're used to seeing. And it's called a home for not old people. I think there's a better word for it than that. But it's an old folks home, what we normally call an old folks home. And something about those places really appeals to me. I really like them. And I've always thought that when I retire, it would be nice to run an old folks home, particularly for old men, because they're kind of a argumentative, fun group of people. Old women I know too well, and I guess they get on my nerves or something, I don't know. So this is called Home for Old Men, Morrill, Nebraska. Start with this house held apart from town, vagrant as their lives have been, huge, rambling, white and old, pocked with narrow windows open to air, and then a veranda, the old custom, fenced and square to circle the walls, a gallery of chairs rocking in silence, where each could sit to take his place or his pipe left to the spark of fire and the quick, short blaze of afterthought. Afternoons I would come to serve them, the sound of a screen door and then a tray, lemonade, or perhaps better still, tea, hot, round in a cup for their shaking, angry hands. Some would bend like mountains of stone, huge, quarrelsome, half-waking bears that chose to take the sun on the warm rock before their cave, shaggy heads lifting at my approach, keen yet to the sound of any slight cracking that might take them unaware. Some would be still and straight as 2x4s, weak spring light making their hair pale as new wood, and their skin into the weight of shavings transparent before the flame. I would be as nothing to them, some faint breeze passing in and out of windows held open above their heads, floating high over the sound of their rocking on wood on the white porch that swept out in clean stretches on either side of them, the dim lines of the painted boards meeting, running on around the corners past their sight. You guys can sign up for my old folks' home if you want to, after we're done tonight. I need something for retirement years, you know. There are also things happening here in town that have effects on me, and one of the ones that had a harsh effect on me and really stayed with me happened in my neighborhood about a year ago when the father killed his family of 3 children and then his wife and then himself, if some of you remember that, here in town. And, you know, I'd walked by that house many, many times, and it looked like a normal home and happy place to me, and to have that happen, it just stayed with me for a long, long time. And I got to thinking about it and wrote this poem in response to that. I expect nothing to happen again. Tonight my eyes burn with the sun going down on itself. I expect nothing to happen, everything having happened once before at least, and since that time repeated over and over and over until what happened last night is just another end of life for another 5 people, the children dead in their sleep and the mother in her covers waiting for the morning to come, and the father, a husband once, and then father 3 times, but first a man and then a son and then something else again until his connections merged into something he didn't recognize any longer, didn't recall right before he shot them all in order, one by one, and then himself. Shouldn't surprise us, shouldn't cause us to stop so much in our tracks like frightened sheep mulling together in some pasture we thought safe, secure, because it never was so safe, never was our pasture. What came to them, all the threats put into shape and color and the smell of death, were just one of many ordinary guarantees, those threats being promises to everyone, ones we seek to follow through, each in our own way of devising, one man killing himself one way and another man killing himself another, and loneliness just invisible skin we wear, birthright and life right, and death the only way we end it, the only way we put to bed our nightmares, close the curtains, put ourselves to rest. We know what's coming, know we all belong with them shot in our beds. Our dreams ended mid-sentence, the silence of the house settling over our bodies until someone finds us. Someone comes, unlocks the door, as it were, stands still at the side of us, the sight of blood on the pillow, the sun coming in through the curtains, dust lying quiet as if it did not want to be discovered, did not want to be asked too many questions, since those in the door know just as much as those in the bed, dead. That still bothers me when I think about it. I hope it continues to. On a more mundane level, this next one's called Conversations, and I don't know, a lot of you I know attend faculty meetings and committee meetings and all those meetings where people talk forever, and you're not sure if anything really gets accomplished. And I start writing poetry quite often in the middle of those meetings. This is about one of those meetings and the feelings I had as I came out of it and during it. Conversations. Most of the day I have spent kicking, trying for light, pushing past the ripples of dark just over my head. Fog has come on like dough, and the water meets me and refuses to pass. It is wet here, and the wetness grows until there is water in my hair and the repeated cold slap of water against my face. I can hear muted voices, large rocks rubbing against each other, talking a steady language of stone. their dark sound chipping off in echoes to be caught in a glass and held in a sway of light or shadow. Every color here is shade, every shade a mixture of blue and cold, and each must work to hold off the shore the thin black line known to be present at the edges and not where the movement comes slowly or is held off by liquid. A pale hand holds one word but lets it go, floating off. A head turns to look for a fading face but misses it, looks again and sees instead the wall that washes by, sees what it cannot see. Bubbles rise in cartoons, empty pauses going to the surface, carrying the captured silence heard between drowning people who wait for air and know the touch of sand beneath them, the uneasy feel of grit in their mouths, a slow winding of black weeds just starting at their legs, their fingers reaching up to break the thick moss beginning to scum in a light green right at the surface. I felt like I was drowning that day. I hope that came across in that one. Okay. Some seasonal poems. We always have to have a few seasonal poems. This one's called Color. Every one of us has in their childhood at one time or the other had to do the thing with the leaf where you saved it and you waxed it or ironed it or traced it or did something with it, because there's a lot of them and elementary teachers run out of ideas in October, I think. And I enjoyed doing that as a youngster, but later as an adult I looked at fall a little differently at different times of my life, and I've combined those two feelings into a poem called Color. Every child has done her duty by the leaf, every last one of us, picked and pressed, colored, or waxed some remnant of autumn, saved the maple or linden like a rag from a rag bag, found the spot of red waving in the street like a handkerchief from the back end of a truck, discovered aspen with yellow as bright as fool's gold to hang on the white of our mother's refrigerator, traced the plain oak leaf, brown as a common wren, but twice as blessed by sharpness, the curve and break and edge of pattern, which is why probably the leaves still bother me, cluttering the streets as they do today, falling in color, burning from a holy bush, the calling of my name in a loud voice, while all the world falls down in flame around me. It's March, but I'm holding out for May. May is going to be kind of an important month this year for me. And this poem was written last May or a little before May, and it's called Close to May. And sometimes fall colors are too much for me, and sometimes spring colors are too much for me. It just kind of is overwhelming, all the colors of spring and the sounds of spring. And this poem kind of explores those feelings. Close to May. Close to May, the air is cool enough in evening to bear the sounds of bells from towers long across the city. A peacock sounds in the dark, his hoarse cry a fever-driven cat, angry and rank with his own heat. I walk the green-black park, flowers blooming invisible, solitary beside me. The sounds mingle in the air, form themselves into links, handcuffs for my wrists, shackles for my feet. I drag my chains like casings, dry, husky rattles that ring with empty seed pods, dead leaves, small feathers save for color, the last note from a cry heard across a dark spring night. The bells are tongues, brittle color staining the palates of their speaking mouths, unleashed to low, deep conversation. Their clamor seems endless. Command all to quit their ringing, to halt the repeated blooming. Restrain the speaking and the calling out for an ear, for a receptacle sufficient to hold you and take you in. The bell should ring without sound, the air full enough with all the petals pushing to the surface, shedding their flesh in birthing cries. A peacock's colors should glow in a night like this, light a circle around his feet, keep him silent in the emptiness. Most of you have probably heard that peacock. I think it's in the park by the Children's Zoo, and it sounds, like something's being murdered out there every evening in the summer, for sure. This poem is along the same lines of sometimes the world is too much with you, and the first line is, everything is marked by too much of itself. Sometimes you see things just too darn clearly, and you just wish everything would kind of blur off the edges a bit. Early rain, late rain. Everything is marked by too much of itself, like new glasses in the 4th grade and the first recognition of each leaf on its tree. The mist of early rain, the softness, the pleasant wandering through places of contours only, of blur and smudge, all turn quickly into black outlines, into sharp sun pouring through windows just cleaned. You see lines everywhere, on faces that were clear glass and now have edges, on photos gray yesterday with nostalgia, now too distinct for even memory to tolerate. Voices come through like single bell strokes, painful, unavoidable, the air around you full of imprints. You hate to think. You remember nothing for a long time. Weeks pass, months, maybe years, when the time is like a long, easy run, and then the breath is knocked out of you by one moment. The intake of one breath is slicing through your lungs of ice. One day stays out of the million you lost, you forgot, misplaced, left behind. You want to lose that day. You get angrier, quicker. An infant's hand waves at its mother's face, too small, too exact. Details haunt, follow you back home. You run to the door, close it, catch your breath in the darkness. Each piece of furniture shows its shape. The walls end in corners, the corners in walls. You think you want space, and even the space follows a plan. Ends, begins, sits in front of you in some perfect way. You flinch at the thought of light. If only the world around you moved less, not close, not certain. If only your mind would blur off its edge, let you sit, feel evening rain, late rain, not in pinpricks on your face, your shoulders, but in a soothing touch of some gentleness you recall from before you started seeing so well. Actually, they should never have gotten me glasses in 4th grade. I probably would have been happy for the rest of my life. Probably not, but... Another thing you learn with time, I think, is you should never go back to places that you have no business revisiting. We don't learn those lessons particularly, and for some reason I have to learn these things over and over again. Maybe you have experienced that feeling too. And this talks about that, learning not to return to places you shouldn't return to. It's called Return. Visiting places you should have left means touching what long ago begged to be left to silence. You never wanted to listen. Tonight the air is so heavy the birds hang in the trees, unable to sing out the evening. The air holds itself a caught breath. Your lungs wait for release, the granted permission to breathe. Tulips had grown there, a garden you planted, and there a bush bloomed with white stars just before the days began to grow so long and so far you couldn't touch them. Point them all out. A turn of branch sends you back. There is nothing you can use anymore. You promised yourself you wouldn't ask for the lesson to be repeated, but we do it every time. If you could stand here long enough in the silence, in the coming dark, you know you could grow into what you left if you haven't already. Blend in with this night so closely no one would see what separated you in the first place. It makes you come back. You left yourself here, or just the sound of your voice. The echoes go on and we can't hear them any longer. Only the air listens. Nothing will tell us to come back. For my excitement this fall, I came down with mumps, which I was supposed to have caught in some younger day, but didn't. Apparently, my mother had forgotten. She didn't remember. And there's something very humbling about staying in bed for a week when you're an adult and feeling just miserable and knowing that things are piling up at work and you should be doing something else, etc., and so forth. And this poem is a result of that, spending a day in bed as an adult, which when I want to do that never happens at the right time when I really want to stay in bed all day, like Monday through Friday. A day in bed. Sick at this age, and spending a day in bed is too much like holding your hand to flame, somewhat foolish and then simply painful. You smell your skin begin to burn before the morning has turned. By noon, the room goes sour. I hear my white-haired neighbor, the tall one, 2 houses away, working on his garage again, the one he said was done for, a goner for sure, in June. All summer he worked, took it apart, the roof, the sloping walls, the door on its hinges, even the foundation, brick removed from crumbling brick. In August he began to put it together until it sat evenly on his lot again, and the walls rose straight, the windows hanging like new paintings in a gallery, and the roof with a line clean enough to hurt the sky. Today he shingles, his stooped shoulders bent like a woman over her bread, while the sun takes his hair slowly from silver to light. I can hear the sound of the nails as they go in, one by one, and I know the wood has to be warm to take it, firm to the touch. Not like my elbows, so sharp today they could tear these sheets, should I decide to turn and try this healing sleep for what it's worth. I'm hurrying you guys, Knots Landing hasn't started yet. Okay, I'm a great walker, and one of the things that I noticed walking last June was that the mulberries fell earlier than they normally do. They fell on the ground much earlier for June, and mulberries make a terrible mess when they fall. If any of you have them over your driveway particularly, they're just lovely, great big purple splotches that look terrible. And this poem is a result of that, and I'll let you decide what it means to you. Dark touches. I didn't expect this. The ground here is shadowed with mulberries too early this June, ahead of their season. Someone told them to drop themselves like sweat, to press the ground with their bodies and let their stain soak far, far down, as far as stain can go to stone. Their color spreads in touches. They leave dark circles in the dirt, open like the mouths of small birds trapped in a nest, crying for darkness to drop from far above them, for the rain to fill them so full that staring into them at dusk you might see the bottom of the sky or the sight of a distant bird so high above the earth it fades off with a slight turn, a right angle of shadow before it is gone, vanished like air in air. My own eyes, pressed like that against my hands, might go dark too before I disappear, show brilliant color against the black, become open mouths that cry in hunger or in silence or just with emptiness, with something like the thirst of the ground, when such drops are small prints of pain, placed exactly so far one from the other. One other kind of Nebraska poem that I wanted to share. My father was a geologist, and as a treat for all of us kids, since there were so many of us, one every year got to go with him when he traveled to the oil fields up in Montana when we were living in Montana. And my trip, I must have been 7 or so, was to Miles City, Montana. And we were driving there late evening, still light enough to see, and there was a windstorm, and the entire landscape was covered by tumbleweeds. I don't know if any of you have ever been out in a good wind, that just all the tumbleweeds, wherever they have hidden up to that time, just come across the land. And this time, I remember, it was, as far as I could see, were tumbleweeds just moving across, and you couldn't see the road. It was just like a huge river. And they piled up in masses against the snow fences, so that eventually they were so piled up it just went right over them. And it left quite an impression on me. And in my travels this fall, I saw them putting up the snow fences, and you get to be familiar with that. They set them up in bands up on the bluffs, and they'll be there one week, and the next week somehow they've magically unrolled. I think they do that, the elves of Nebraska do that at night or something. I never see people doing it, but there they are. This one's called Snow Fences. The farmers have rolled out the snow fences for the season and left them here, still wrapped, small banded circles of wood in weight on the bluffs. They look dark and slender against the wheat stalk, neat as punctuation on land that seems warm in October, grackles riding the wires as if they had all the time in the world left them, and to the raucous toss of their calling. Driving with my father to oil fields in Montana, I remember miles of snow fences beside us, how they caught tumbleweed blown there by winds so strong our car shook like a boat in storm. Such small patterns for trees, stems like trunks, and the growing mounds of tiny broken branches, once running like a brown river across the road, now trapped and held, piling behind the wood margin so that we could pass, reach a place where there was light, food, other voices. Glad to see the fences go up when winter comes, where the snow can grow high and cold behind them, and only drifts of white fingers can touch my road, reach out during some ground blizzard that might threaten to clear the earth entirely, blast it bare of any trace of highway or or path to home, blow out the light with the breath of a stranger. It pays to plan ahead for such things, buy candles for the duration and matches, set this slender wood high one day in autumn like staves to form a ship before it sails, or frame a house that one day could keep us in. I'd like to end with a poem that I wrote last spring, and it's a preface to my collection because I think it says what I want to say to a lot of people. I live in a duplex, and my window, like many duplexes, faces another duplex, and we're about this close to one another. I have a kitchen window. I wash my dishes there every night, and right across from me is a kitchen window where somebody else washes their dishes every night. And for years, I've lived in this place for about 5 years now. An older woman lived over there, and she would wash her dishes every night in winter the same time I did, but she would never look up at me, and it used to drive me crazy. I'd sit there smiling like a fool, waiting for her to look up so I could say hi, you know, friendly. And the spring came, and I hadn't seen her for a while, and I was walking to work, and a neighbor was out, and I said, what happened to the lady that lives upstairs? And they said that she'd passed away. Well, I got just really angry at this woman for having the nerve to die without once looking up and saying hello. I mean, of all the things to do to a person. And it got me to thinking how mad I have gotten at times with friends and family and loved ones who walk out of my life and I can't do a single thing about it. They either move away or they pass away or somehow distance comes between us, and I decided I'm really not going to allow that to happen any further, any longer. And this is called Warning to You Who Know Me. You can all get up and leave now. Warning to you who know me. The snow falls all evening. We stand at separate windows that face each other. She is white-haired, her head bowed like prayer, rinsing night dishes for one long winter. If she once raised her face to mine, it would have glowed like a firefly in summer. For a year she has been gone. Her window, so full of other faces, is traced with radiance. The light you see when you close your eyes, and the clock goes on like dripping time. It's time someone set you straight. If any one of you turn from me, walk straight away from here in a line as close as you might draw it. Turn and walk exactly into the distance without ever stopping, without ever even looking back for a print of time. You can never walk out of view. Once you stop, you would still be here. I could close my eyes, I could lose sight of you, you not even a point on the horizon. If you turned to check for me, you would be face to face with now. You could argue that sight will dim us down, that color will fade from our eyes, blue ink from water, that we will no longer be pierced by swords or set to numbness by any drink we take. Yes, everything will break apart, and every part will fail outright. Such things happen. But I think it's time you knew. There is no far enough to keep us lost from sight. Behind the glass, your face. Thank you for coming.